December 7th, 1941, a day that would live in infamy. As Japanese planes rained destruction on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, America, wary of entering another global conflict, suddenly found itself thrust into World War II. At that moment, the U.S. military was significantly underprepared for the scale of the war that lay ahead. Its forces were scattered, its factories focused on peacetime production, and the public largely unready for the sacrifices that total war would demand. But what Japan may not have realized was that in their attack, they had unwittingly awoken a sleeping giant. The United States was now fully mobilizing for war, and it wasn't just the soldiers and the sailors who would be called upon. The entire nation, every man, woman, and child, would have a role to play in securing victory. To achieve this, the nation needed more than soldiers and guns. It needed to rally the spirit of an uncertain nation, to unite its people in a single purpose: winning the war. This is where propaganda became a crucial tool, shaping how the American people viewed their role in the war effort and turning the Homefront into an essential battleground for victory. In order to help win a war of this scale, a nation must utilize the full strength of its economy, its workforce, and the combined efforts of individual commitment. Every sector of society, factories, farms, households, needed to shift gears, contributing to the war effort in any way possible. Materials had to be produced at an unprecedented rate, resources conserved, and morale kept high. Recognizing this, the U.S. established the Office of War Information, or OWI, in 1942 to coordinate propaganda efforts. The OWI ensured that all government messaging carried a unified narrative that not only informed but inspired Americans to fully support the war effort. Because it wasn't enough to simply demand more production or request sacrifice, Americans needed to be inspired, to feel personally connected to the war effort. Through powerful images, slogans, and messages, propaganda stirred a sense of duty, pride, and unity. It made every citizen, from the factory worker to the farmer, believe that they were a part of something bigger, something crucial to winning the war. And they were, but Americans needed to feel it. So propaganda became the driving force behind efforts like war bonds, rationing, and the transformation of American industry into the arsenal of democracy.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
One thing that is for certain is that war is expensive. And at the time, the US was just recovering from the Great Depression and lacked the crucial funding needed for a global war. Thus, one of the earliest and most critical areas where propaganda made an impact was in rallying financial support. The US government needed massive funds to sustain military operations, and war bonds became the primary method to raise that money. But convincing the average American to invest their hard-earned savings into war bonds required a compelling narrative. Through posters, radio broadcasts, and even Hollywood films, the government and private partners urged Americans to see buying war bonds not as a financial transaction, but as a patriotic duty. Slogans like "Buy a share in America" and "If you can't enlist, invest" were emblazoned on eye-catching posters, often featuring images of brave soldiers, proud families, and the American flag. Even celebrities like Clark Gable and Bette Davis joined the cause, lending their star power to bond drives. In fact, Hollywood organized some of the biggest war bond rallies in the country. These larger-than-life campaigns turned war bonds into symbols of national unity. By making citizens understand that they were directly supporting the troops on the front lines, these efforts helped raise over $180 billion over the course of the war and ensured that the U.S. military had the financial backing it needed. While financial support was essential, America's ability to outproduce its enemies was the backbone of the war effort. At the time, the U.S. did have a relatively strong manufacturing base. In fact, the national GDP was over double that of the second largest economy, the Soviet Union. But the manufacturing was largely geared toward peacetime productions, and factories across the country needed to shift from making consumer goods to producing tanks, planes, ships, and munitions at an extraordinary rate. But how do you convince a nation still recovering from the Great Depression to not only work harder, but also accept rationing and restrictions on everyday goods? Once again, propaganda stepped in to frame this shift as not just necessary but heroic. Posters and advertisements declared that production wins wars and called on workers to see themselves as soldiers on the home front. Images of workers standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, each playing a vital role in securing freedom, became ubiquitous. With this campaign, Rosie the Riveter became an enduring symbol, encouraging women to step into factory roles traditionally held by men who were now overseas fighting. The iconic image of a determined Rosie flexing her arm under the slogan "We can do it" symbolized both empowerment and national duty as millions of American women entered the workforce, transforming the industrial landscape and surging production to a rate that could sustain the war. While American factories were producing at an unprecedented rate, there was still the challenge of conserving essential resources for the war effort. Metal, rubber, gasoline, and even food were needed overseas, and that meant civilians had to make sacrifices. Propaganda played a central role in making rationing and conservation feel like a patriotic duty. Certain posters reminded citizens that when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, encouraging carpooling to save fuel. Others showed how scraps of metal from ordinary households could be turned into tanks or bullets, making the smallest contributions feel significant. Ration books became a symbol of participation, and propaganda assured Americans that by using them, they were directly aiding their soldiers on the front lines. In addition to rationing, the government pushed the idea of victory gardens, small personal vegetable gardens that would help reduce the strain on the commercial food supply. Propaganda campaigns encouraged citizens to dig for victory by growing their own food, framing it as an essential contribution to the war effort. Millions of Americans responded, transforming backyards and vacant lots into productive spaces. These gardens provided food and boosted morale, showing that even in times of sacrifice, American ingenuity and self-reliance could prevail. As the war raged on in Europe and the Pacific, the threat of espionage became a significant concern for the US government. The fear that enemy agents could be lurking in neighborhoods, workplaces, and even social circles fueled a sense of paranoia on the home front. To combat this threat, the government put concerted effort into shaping public awareness and encouraging vigilance. Posters plastered across towns and cities warned civilians that loose lips sink ships. The message was clear: careless talk could cost American lives. Whether it was in the workplace, at home, or in public, the idea that seemingly innocent conversations could be overheard by the enemy spies was hammered into the American psyche. Propaganda urged citizens to keep their mouths shut and avoid discussing war-related topics, whether it was troop movements or production details. Even casual talk about letters from loved ones serving overseas could inadvertently give the enemy valuable information. Cartoons, films, and radio programs amplified this message. Even Walt Disney Studios contributed, producing propaganda films like Victory Through Air Power, which heightened awareness about espionage and enemy threats. Other cartoons depicted spies as sinister, shadowy figures blending into everyday life. The goal was to instill a sense of personal responsibility in every American. Everyone was urged to see themselves as a guardian of national security. With slogans like "The enemy is listening" and "Silence means security," propaganda heightened the sense of duty civilians felt to protect their nation's secrets.
I just learned a secret. It's a honey. It's a pip. But the enemy is listening, so I'll never let it slip. 'Cause when I learn a secret, boy, I zipper up my lip.
Through these campaigns, everyday Americans were transformed into the first line of defense, reminded constantly that their actions and words could either save or doom their fellow citizens. But while much of the propaganda on the home front was focused on unity and patriotism, there was a darker side to these efforts. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, fear and suspicion towards Japanese Americans began to grow, stoked by government propaganda and media portrayals that depicted them as potential threats to national security. The US government capitalized on these fears, leading to one of the most controversial decisions of the war: the forced internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans. Propaganda was leveraged to justify this drastic action. Posters and films suggested that Japanese Americans, many of whom were patriotic US citizens, were spies or saboteurs working on behalf of the Japanese Empire. Despite the lack of evidence, this idea that Japanese Americans were inherently disloyal became embedded in public consciousness, fueled by racist stereotypes and wartime paranoia. Films like Japanese Relocation portrayed the internment as a necessary security measure, casting the relocation centers in a falsely positive light, places where Japanese Americans could wait out the war safely. In reality, families were uprooted from their homes, businesses were lost, and individuals were forced to live in harsh, cramped conditions in remote camps across the country. The propaganda machine minimized the sufferings and injustice of internment, framing it as a necessity to protect Americans from internal threats. This use of propaganda highlights how powerful this type of messaging can be. When wielded irresponsibly, it can lead to severe violations of civil rights and liberties. While most propaganda during World War II rallied the nation for positive causes, the Japanese internment stands in stark contrast, a reminder of how fear and prejudice can be weaponized to devastating effect. World War II was not only a global military conflict, but also a battle patriotically waged on the home front. Propaganda became the thread that wove the fabric of unity, sacrifice, and resilience that defined the American war effort. It rallied an uncertain public, turned industries into war machines, and helped create a shared sense of purpose that transcended individual sacrifice. From buying war bonds to planting victory gardens, every American felt they had a role to play in achieving victory. But as with all powerful tools, the propaganda of the Second World War had its darker side. The same messaging that unified the country also fueled suspicion, fear, and in the case of Japanese internment, led to gross violations of civil liberties. It is a reminder that while propaganda can inspire and mobilize, it can also manipulate and divide when wielded irresponsibly. The impact of World War II propaganda left a lasting mark on how governments and societies use media to rally public support in times of crisis. The lessons learned in shaping public perception during the war laid the groundwork for modern public relations, advertising, and even political campaigns. The power to inspire, mobilize, and unite, or to manipulate and mislead, remains as relevant today as it was during those pivotal years. And hey, if you found this video interesting, make sure you drop a sub and go check out my other propaganda-related content. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.